This is slide 4 of our 60s Vietnam unit. And as much as the Vietnam War was known for what was going on in Vietnam, it's equally as known for what was going on here at home in terms of the protests surrounding the war. Okay? And some names here that you're going to need to know, big names in terms of the protest movement, starts with the SDS. That stands for Students for a Democratic Society. Students for a Democratic Society. And there's, you see the button over here on the right, there's a change going to come. They are led by a man named Tom Hayden. Okay? And Hayden was one of the biggest names in terms of protesting during the 60s and into the 70s as well. Hayden will lead the Students for a Democratic Society. It's going to focus on college campuses and college students. It won't just be sort of anti-war. They actually start as a civil rights protest group, an anti-poverty group, and then when the war gets going, they branch into anti-war stuff. So lots of different things. But the basic message behind the Students for a Democratic Society is something called participatory democracy. Okay? Participatory democracy. This is the basic message of the Students for a Democratic Society. And it basically just calls on not only students, but all people to get involved with government. That nonviolent civil disobedience is the way to go, and that individual citizens should help make the social decisions that affect their lives, that Congress is not representing the people, that the people need to stand up and represent themselves, that people should get directly involved in democracy, that more decisions need to be made at the local level with people making them, not government, because clearly government has just led to civil rights abuses and widespread poverty in the country and the mess in Vietnam. Government has let us down. It's time for people to directly participate in their democracy. Now again, Hayden called for peaceful, nonviolent protesting. There is a faction of the group that does not believe that enough is getting done through Hayden's peaceful nonviolence. And by the way, this is Tom Hayden right here. So a group known as the Weathermen break off from the Students for a Democratic Society to form their own sort of underground terrorist group. There's a change coming, much like the weather does. It's where they get their name. And the change coming in their mind is a violent overthrow of the government. The Weathermen promote a violent overthrow of the government, and they bomb a series of government buildings. Many in the Weathermen are made up of very disgruntled veterans coming back from the war. You would have demolitions experts trained in blowing things up would join the Weathermen and bomb government buildings. Vietnam is the first war we see where we have veterans coming home from the war and protesting the war that's still going on. Usually, if all else fails, the military can get behind the war that they're fighting. That is not the case here. This is veterans coming home saying, the war is a mess, we have no business over there, we need to get the rest of our soldiers home. And a lot of those guys join the Weathermen to promote this violent overthrow of the government. One of the largest protests that we see begins at the Lincoln Memorial, but will end with a march to the Pentagon. Now, the Pentagon is military headquarters, and if you are protesting a military action, a war that you have a problem with, what better place to go protest than military headquarters? So about 100,000 people rallied at the Lincoln Memorial, and then marched to the Pentagon. This is October 1967, just to give you a timeline here. October 67. It would take about a little over 2 days for the government to completely disperse the crowd at the Pentagon. Not all 100,000 go to the Pentagon. About 30,000 or so of the 100 make their way to the Pentagon, but they will ring the Pentagon. They will surround it completely, and you get this very famous photograph here that comes out of this this protest. Here you see all the military police that were blocking the Pentagon, and here you see some of the protesters. And the very famous guy, the hippie here, putting daisies in the barrels of the soldiers' rifles. And as a soldier, you simply had to stand there and take it. There was absolutely nothing you could do. If you hit the guy, you'd be brought up on charges because, what is your possible defense? You couldn't claim self-defense. What, he was attacking you with a daisy? He's doing nothing to you. You simply have to stand there and take it. And it's very demasculating as a soldier, a male soldier here, to have a flower placed in your gun barrel. But you simply have to stand there and take it. The Pentagon protest would be one of the most famous of the war. Okay? Another very famous protest occurs at Kent State. Okay? Now, something we need to say here about the protest movement. Okay? Most of the protests involve college students or take place on college campuses. And that is because if you were a college student, you were exempt from the draft. You could not be drafted if you were a college student. So what you end up with is enrollment at colleges exploding throughout the 60s and early 70s. You end up with a lot of people who didn't really want to be at college, but they'd rather be at college than fighting in Vietnam. So they go to college. So most of the protesters are children of wealthy parents or politicians who can afford college. Most of the soldiers are poor who can't afford college to get out of the draft. So a lot of the protests take place on college campuses because college students were exempt from the draft. The most famous of these occurs at Kent State in Ohio. And at Kent State, you have several thousand protesters gathering on campus. The president of the university contacts the governor and says, look, you got to give me some help. So the governor sends the National Guard to Kent State. Okay? And the National Guard and the protesters will clash. The National Guard has set up a line across campus. Protesters are making their way toward the line. Now, everything is peaceful enough at the beginning. But then, depending on who you believe, if you believe the National Guard troops and the government, the protesters turned on them and were attacking. If you believe the students, the protesters were simply peacefully protesting, and the National Guard fired into them without provocation. Regardless of which side you believe, National Guard troops opened fire on U.S. college students. Okay? 4 students were shot and killed at Kent State by U.S. National Guard troops. Now, the very famous photo here at the bottom you see, one of the dead there lying on the ground. 2 of the 4 weren't even protesters. They were simply college students making their way from one side of campus to another to go from one class to the next. They just happened to be cutting across the wrong part of campus at the wrong time, ran into this protest, and got shot by National Guard troops. There's a very famous protest song of this time by Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young called Ohio, the refrain, 4 dead in Ohio. And it refers to the shooting at Kent State. So another one of those not so bright and shining moments in our history here. President Nixon gets about sick and tired, as President Johnson had, of hearing nothing but the protesters. Nixon actually believes that the majority of Americans support the war. They support U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and they support what the government is doing. Nixon refers to them as the silent majority. He says it's the protesters that are getting their voices heard. The few are screaming the loudest. And very famous quote from Nixon, you see here at the bottom on the bumper sticker there. It is time for the great silent majority of Americans to stand up and be counted. And Nixon was probably right. Majority of Americans probably did support the war. They just weren't speaking up and saying it. The protesters were the only ones making their voices heard. And when both sides aren't speaking up, people are going to listen to the one side that is. So the protesters will get the most attention here, and throughout the 60s into the 70s will make a lot of noise.